Bruce Schaefer here with Ellis Investment Partners. Thank you for joining. In today's video, we're going to take a look at from a high level retirement spending and how we can utilize Monte Carlo analysis to help determine an appropriate spending target for ourselves, as well as to help guide spending throughout retirement. So I'm going to share my screen here momentarily, similar to the last video. But before we dive into those details, I just want to touch on a few quick points. First being Monte Carlo analysis and what that is. If you're unfamiliar with that term, essentially how we utilize it in financial planning and retirement modeling, instead of assuming a flat year-over-year rate of return for your portfolio, Monte Carlo analysis helps us insert and simulate market volatility and market assumptions. So essentially we take your portfolio, its projected, its asset allocation and sub-asset allocation. We match that up with your projected cash flows in retirement, what's coming in versus what distribution need do we expect. And then we simulate hypothetical markets, everything from poor markets to average market performance to outperformance. And what this does is it allows us to get a sense of the trajectory we could see your portfolio taking, given the variety of markets that you may face throughout your retirement. And it allows us to see, hey, are there any concerns, any big opportunity areas that we would have in the longevity of your portfolio? Because it is simulating those negative performance, which then incorporates sequence of return risk, right? Which is where early on in retirement, you might have your negative years where you're pulling from the portfolio, and that could change the whole trajectory of your portfolio throughout retirement. So a couple other quick points here. We'll run through this analysis. As I mentioned, we can utilize it to help us determine an appropriate spending rate in retirement. How we do that, this Monte Carlo analysis is going to provide us with a success rate on your overall retirement outlook. And that success rate, essentially what that's telling us is of all the scenarios that we run, in this case, we run 1,000. Of those 1,000 hypothetical markets that we run, how many of those scenarios did your portfolio last the tested time period? And most commonly, we utilize life expectancy for the tested time period. So to back into a spending target with Monte Carlo analysis, I typically recommend that we try to aim for a target of around 90%. Any lower than that, and we could potentially be putting the portfolio in unnecessary harm long term. And any higher than that, and we're potentially not getting the most out of your savings. We're potentially leaving more money on the table for yourself that you could be spending or utilizing however you'd like in retirement, and getting the most out of the savings that you've accumulated. Also, that's the spending target. How we utilize it to help guide our spending in retirement is by setting thresholds, a lower threshold and an upper threshold. And when we eclipse these thresholds throughout retirement, that triggers us to rebalance our spending, essentially, kind of adjust our spending target. And that can work in two ways, of course, right? If we have underperforming markets and your portfolio is not returning what we were planning for throughout retirement, you're eventually going to see your success rate drop a little bit. Again, if we start off at that 90% and then we have a few rough years to start off in retirement, you could see your success rate drop. And for our lower threshold, I typically run with a 75%. So if we do this year over year and make this an annual exercise, and after a few rough years, we check in and your success rate is no longer 90%, we're now at say 74%. That would trigger a rebalance, so to speak, or a resetting of your target spending. On the contrary, the optimistic side, if markets outperform what we've been planning for and our success rate increases from 90 to above the upper threshold, which I like to set at 95%, that would trigger another resetting of the target, but an upward resetting. Essentially, we'd be able to spend more in retirement than we were originally planning for, still kind of getting the most out of our savings. So again, I'm going to share my screen here momentarily just to kind of walk through and illustrate how this plays out. Of course, these clients that I've built into our software are completely hypothetical. I've built in a recently retired couple, and I've made their financial picture extremely simple for demonstrative purposes. But as you can see here, the couple's 67 years old. They are currently retired, and we're planning a life expectancy of age 95. So a 28-year time horizon in retirement. The only income that we're planning for in retirement is Social Security. And their desired expenses in retirement, we're planning for $90,000 a year as their expenses after taxes. So we'll head on over to our decision center, which runs an array of analysis for us. And here we originally see a model of their retirement using the straight line appreciation method. For these clients, we built in a 5% average annual year-over-year return. That's that other comparative outlook that I discussed earlier that you can use alternatively to the Monte Carlo. So we'll switch over here to the Monte Carlo analysis. And again, this is where it's running 1,000 different hypothetical scenarios for these clients. And as we see, they come back for spending $90,000 a year. They come back in absolutely great shape. We're seeing a 99% success rate. And then again, this would tell me that there is room for these clients to increase their expenses should they like. Again, remember, we want the target spending to be a 90% success rate. So how we can determine what a 90% success rate would be and what expenses that would lead to, we can use our optimizer tools here. So we come down here and we can input that we want to plan for a 90% success rate. We apply that to these models and we run a maximum retirement spending analysis. And as we see here, they come back that they could actually spend $101,000 to reduce that target down to 90%. So we incorporate that in here. And now these clients are able to spend an extra $11,000 that they compared to what they're originally planning for. Right, that's almost an extra $1,000 a month that these clients can now spend. That could be an extra vacation each year, or a club membership, or gifts to family, or college savings for grandkids. However, this couple wants to spend that $11,000 a year, they can do so, and we see they're still in outstanding shape. And as you see here, here's the 91% success rate for them, spending $101,000 a year. So from here, let's take a look at how the lower and upper thresholds come into play and how they work. So to start, we're going to incorporate some bad years into this retirement, some underperforming markets into this couple's retirement, and see how this impacts them. So first, we'll take a look at what happens if markets underperform the first couple years of retirement. And we run that calculation in that simulation. We see now their success rate has dropped from 91% down to 82%. That's still above our 75% lower threshold. So this would not trigger a reduction in spending. But let's say markets continue to underperform for an additional year, right? We have 3 years starting off retirement with some rough market years. And when we rerun this calculation, we see now their success rate has dropped to 72%. That's now below our lower threshold. And in this event, it would be advisable to reduce their expenses. We're now in an area where, yes, 72% of the time we would be completely fine and have their portfolio last their lifetime. But there's also 28% of the scenarios that we run here where this couple does now deplete their assets during their lifetime should they continue spending $101,000 a year. So it's a little more than we're comfortable with. And again, in this sense, it would trigger a recommendation to reduce their target spending. But since we're staying on top of this, we can make this necessary adjustment, and it should be rather minor since we're changing the spending sooner rather than later. So what we do in this event, we would recalculate their maximum retirement expenses here. We recalculate it back down to that back up to a 90% target. And we see here, this would recommend a reduction in expenses from $101,000 down to $95,000 a year. So about a $6,000 less a year in spending, or overall about $500 a month less in spending to get them back on track. And when they implement that here, you now see we're back up to that 91% success rate that we're comfortable with. So that's how we utilize that in an underperforming market situation. Now let's take a look at the optimistic side. Let's say markets outperform expectations and how we can utilize this to potentially increase expenses in retirement as well. So we recalculate our Monte Carlo here. We get back to our 99% success rate. We calculate for 90. We have our $101,000 in expense target that we implement. Now, let's say from here that markets outperform expectations, right? And for the first 5 years of retirement, this couple's portfolio performs very well. So we check in, and in this event now, they're at a 97% success rate. That is above that 95% upper threshold that we had discussed, and that would now trigger the potential to increase expenses. So again, we come back down here. This couple spending 101,000. We want to recalculate back down to that 90 percentile. And we see here now they could spend $106,000 and still be at that 90% target. So that's now an additional $5,000 a year that this couple could spend. Or if you want to look at it from the original planning where they thought they could spend $90,000, they're now $16,000 a year more in average annual expenses, and they would still be completely okay moving forward. And then you do this year over year. Typically, I like to make this an annual exercise so that you stay on top of it. But basically, we look at how did the previous year's investment returns, inflation, and our market assumptions moving forward, how did all of that impact your success rate? And from there, we can determine, hey, is a reduction in spending recommended at this time? Can we spend more than originally planned? But that's kind of how we utilize this analysis to help guide our spending throughout retirement. But that's a short little illustration on how we can utilize Monte Carlo analysis with our retirement spending. I hope you enjoyed it. I do appreciate you joining me. If you have any questions, if you'd find this type of analysis beneficial, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, my name is Drew Schaefer. I'm a financial advisor and planner with Ellis Investment Partners. I'm always happy to touch base with you. Again, my contact information will be at the end here momentarily. Feel free to reach out by email, phone, LinkedIn. Always happy to connect and touch base. But thanks again for joining, and I hope you have a great day.